Good evening from Los Angeles. I'm Charlie Coker, Executive Director of Asia Society Southern California. Welcome to our program, Affordable Housing, Lessons from Singapore and Los Angeles. Tonight's program is part of our ongoing U.S.-Asia Real Estate Initiative, which is an undertaking in collaboration with the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate and the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. The U.S.-Asia Real Estate Initiative is a comprehensive multi-year initiative to promote a deeper understanding of real estate issues that are of shared importance to Southern California and urban areas in Asian countries, and is generously underwritten by OUE, a prominent Singapore-based real estate development firm. Our program tonight seeks to examine solutions to the pressing global problem of housing insecurity and related land use issues from experts in Singapore and Los Angeles. Our moderator for this evening is Professor Richard Green, Director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate. In addition to his duties at Lusk, Richard is a professor at the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy and the Marshall School of Business. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Richard. Thank you.
Charlie, thank you very much. And welcome everybody for joining. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. I think this is a very special hour we're going to have together, talking about some of the housing and planning issues facing Los Angeles and Singapore. Our first speaker is going to be a person who's had a remarkable career, Dr. Cheong Koon Hean, who is currently chairman of the Center for Livable Cities, but also the chair of the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, the Singapore University of Technology and Design. When I say she's had a remarkable career, I am not engaging in any kind of hyperbole. She has been CEO of both the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore. She had that role from 2004 to 2010, and then was CEO of the Housing Development Board of Singapore from 2010 to 2020. For those who are not familiar with these institutions, the first of these is sort of equivalent to the planning department of a major American city, although it's not just a city, of course, it's a country, but it's the entity that deals with thinking about zoning and land use and so on. The Housing Development Board is the developer of public housing in Singapore, which makes up about 85% of the housing stock in that country. Under her watch, the Housing Development Board built about 1 million units. California, at its current building pace, does not build 1 million units a year. It does not build 1 million units every 10 years, even though California has 40 million people and Singapore has about 7 million people. So the scale of production that she oversaw was quite remarkable. And so I'm going to ask her to speak for about 25 minutes. After her, we will have Vince Bertoni, who, as I know many of you know, is Director of Planning for the City of Los Angeles. Mr. Bertoni has also had a remarkable career, having been involved in planning or economic development in a very large variety of municipalities in Southern California, ranging, as we were discussing before we came on the air, from Malibu on the Pacific Ocean and one of the wealthiest enclaves in all of the Los Angeles metropolitan area, to Rancho Cucamonga, which is in the Inland Empire. It's actually a prosperous place in the Inland Empire, but nevertheless in a very different sort of place. Certainly the planning challenges are quite different in Cucamonga than they are in Malibu, and sort of every place in between. I'm happy to note that before he ran planning for Los Angeles, he ran planning for Pasadena, which is where I happen to live. So in terms of understanding the conflicts that exist in Southern California with respect to both planning and housing issues, we could ask for no better commentary than that from Vince Bertoni. And then last up will be Mike Manville. Mike is an associate professor affiliated with the Luskin Center at our friends down the 10 from us, UCLA. I should say beyond that, Mike and I became co-authors for the first time this year, and it was a great experience getting to work with him on a project which was on how are people in Los Angeles actually paying their rent in a time of crisis. So the way this is going to go is I've asked Dr. Cheong to begin, and she's going to have a slide presentation, speak for about 25 minutes. And then a response from Vince, where he is going, from Mr. Bertoni, where he is going to give us some thoughts on how the lessons from Singapore may or may not apply to Los Angeles. And then finally, I've put Mike in the cleanup spot, so he's going to have to synthesize that all on the fly. And I've asked him to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will open it up to Q&A, which I will moderate. Let me ask if you have a question for any of our panelists to please put it in the Q&A box. You will see it at the lower right corner of your screen, and I will moderate the questions as best I can. Sometimes what I do is combine similar questions into one so as many people as possible can have their thoughts shared with the panel. And so with that, Dr. Cheong, again, thanks so much for being with us this evening or this morning in Singapore. Please take it away.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for having me and allowing me to share our own experience in the development of housing a nation, basically in Singapore. So let me just click on some slides to share. All right, I think you can see that. Okay, all right, I hope everyone can see the slides. Well, good morning again. Today, I'm just going to share a little bit about our experience in how to provide affordable homes for Singapore. So let me just start. I think we're all very familiar with the 17 Global Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, one of the key goals is about building sustainable cities and communities. And decent affordable housing is really at the center of sustainable cities. And we know some 1.2 billion of urban population actually do not have access to affordable and secure housing. This is a picture of Singapore some 50 to 60 years ago. And it's hard to believe for all of you who may have had the opportunity to visit Singapore. But Singapore was really a nation of slums and squatters about 50 years ago. And I remember the situation when I was a very little girl. And that was a long time ago. But so because of that, the Housing and Development Board actually was formed, or HDB in short, to build affordable public housing for Singaporeans. Public housing in Singapore is, well, the equivalent names in other cities is social housing. So over 60 years, we've built about 1.1 million flats. So I just want to correct a little bit about what Richard said. We built a 1.1 million over 60 years. But even then, it's just thousands of units that we had to build per year. And we started with very basic housing. And of course, we kept improving them over time. So today in my sharing, I just want to highlight 4 key thrusts that the Housing and Development Board has adopted to try to house a nation literally. And these are the 4 thrusts that I'm going to talk about. It's on the screen. So let's start with the first one about prioritizing home ownership. First, it's the road to home ownership. I like to just touch on some key milestones that were very important to set the stage. In 1960, we actually built very low-cost basic housing, and they were mainly rental. But in 1964, we decided that we wanted people to own their homes, and I will explain why later. And we introduced the Land Acquisition Act in 1967, where the legislation allowed us to acquire land so that we could build public housing. And of course, we had to pay off for the acquisition. And right now, any acquisition is paid full market rates. But at the same time, we will have to make sure we had resettlement policies, even as we acquired land for public housing. Another very major milestone was the introduction of what we call the Central Provident Fund, or the CPF, which is in a way, a pension fund, a social savings for every Singaporean. And we introduced that in 1967 and allowed it to be used for public housing. We started the journey of home ownership. But why home ownership? All over the world, a lot of the housing, which is for low income or middle income, is really for rental. It's because we were a very young nation then. We became independent only in 1965. We wanted to provide everyone with a stake in the country. It would encourage better maintenance of the flats, build a very strong work ethic because you have to pay your mortgages, provide an asset and a store of value. I'll explain that later. And it promote rootedness and belonging. And our policies actually cater to life cycle needs. We take care of young couples and help them to buy their first home. And when they have a family, we help them to upgrade to a larger flat. And when they're old, we help them to unlock the home equity and to age in place if they want to. And we provide very elderly friendly homes. And we also cater for the singles to buy smaller housing so that it's affordable to them. And second point is, how do we then ensure affordability? Basically, we offer a very wide range of options for different budgets and needs. So the type of housing units range from 2, 3, 4, 5 room flats and 3 generation flats, which are larger flats. And of course, at the high end, people will buy private property. And we ensure quite a lot of subsidies are given to help to buy the housing. And it ranges from market subsidies to enhanced housing grants. And it is tiered, as you can see in the steps. The lower your income ceiling, the higher your housing grant. I'm not going to go through the details, but the gist of it is really that it's a tiered grant. So lower income, higher the grant. And if you're at a very low income, you could get more than 100 over thousand Singapore dollars in terms of grants. And again, this is a rather complicated picture, but it's just to show that we give grants when you buy a new flat. We also give you grants when you buy a resale flat from the secondary market, because in Singapore, after you buy a highly subsidized flat, if you live in it for 5 years, you can actually sell it in the resale market. And we also have higher end housing, which starts as public housing and then become a private condominium after 10 years. We also help people to be able to own this through grants. Now, of course, the question really is the government cannot have all the resources and keep giving grants. So how do we ensure affordability? A very important mechanism is the use of the Central Provident Fund, or the CPF, to finance housing. So let me just explain this. In Singapore, if you are employed, your employee contribution, I contribute 20% of my wages to my CPF. The employer contributes 17%. So every Singaporean who works has a very high savings rate of 37% of their income, of which 6% goes into an account for retirement. You can't touch this money. 8% go to a Medisave account to buy medical insurance. And 23% can be used to buy a home, to pay CPF insurance, and for your investments and education of your children. So in this case, all Singaporeans are actually covered by medical insurance, and plus their pension fund for retirement. Now, so if the Housing Development Board prices its flats at no more than, say, 20-25% of somebody's income, you can almost pay for your monthly mortgage just using that 23% CPF, if you're prudent in the choice of a flat that you can afford. And this means that, in fact, more than 80% of my residents do not come out with any cash every month, no cash, and they can afford to pay the mortgage from the CPF. And this would be below the international benchmark of about 30 to 35% of income for affordable housing. In Singapore, you'll be paying something like 15 to 25% of your income for housing. So if you compare the house price to income ratio, in fact, a lot of this data is from Demographia, you find that in Singapore, the HPI is only about 4.7 compared to Hong Kong, which is 20.8. My numbers show me Los Angeles is 9, but I don't know whether that's correct. Perhaps you could clarify later. Now, this is an important graph. As a result, today, 94% of our flats are owned and only 6% are rental, and for very low income. And if you look at the graph, home ownership took off the moment we allowed CPF to be used to pay mortgages and to finance housing. But having said that, the government still has to subsidize. So in the funding of public housing, the financing of capital expenditure is done through a bond issuance. We have a $32 billion medium-term note, that's about 24 billion US dollars. A government still gives some loans. And actually, interestingly, the Housing and Development Board is probably the second largest bond issuer in Singapore after the central bank. So I'm partly also an issuer of bonds. And the government also finances mortgage loans, and they finance the deficits. But the question is then, how much is the deficit? Is it very large? Well, broadly, the deficits range from about 0.75 billion US dollars to about less than 2 billion US dollars. It fluctuates because of construction cost. But this turns out to be only about 3 to 4% of our annual budget, which means that actually to get home ownership of 90 over percent at 3 to 4% of the annual budget, we think it's quite reasonable. Now, the third is that our housing policies actually are very detailed to meet different segmented needs. So if you're a single, we provide smaller two-room flats and we still give you a grant, though less than that for our family. If you're elderly, there's a lot of support and housing policies. I'm just going to run through very quickly. We facilitate mutual care and support. So we give priority to allocating flats with children and parents to live together nearby to each other. We built larger three-generation flats to house families. So it's very family oriented. We try to facilitate monetization because when they grow old, if they have three bedrooms, they could rent out two bedrooms because their children will have moved on to buy their own new flat. And we also buy back the flats with the remaining leases, and we can pay you money for the flat. So it's all based on 99-year lease. So if you've lived in it for, say, 30 over years, you can sell it back to me for the 60-year lease. I'll give you the money. And then with the money, you put into the Central Provident Fund and you have an annual income annuity for life. But at the same time, you can still live in your flat. So I won't go into great detail because there are many policies covering this. And of course, we try to create an elderly friendly environment, carrying out upgrading works, making sure they are barrier free. We also try to support vulnerable groups. The picture here actually shows our rental housing, which is actually all the same quality as our public housing. You have the same amenities. It's just that they can't afford to own it. But we will track these rental flat tenants and we handhold them eventually towards home ownership as far as possible. So this is the 6% who live in rental housing. The last part of my presentation is about ensuring a sustainable and high quality environment. With 80% of the people living in public housing flats, we cannot afford them to become social slums. So we have to upgrade and to keep them upgraded and of high quality. So let me just illustrate with the planning of a typical town. This is one of our newer towns called Punggol, which is actually along the waterfront. So when we plan for comprehensive facilities for work, live, play, and learn environment with good public transport. And we try to create distinctive districts so that they're interesting and with good designs. And we infuse it with a lot of blue and green elements. So for example, in this case, there were two rivers. And what we did was we dammed up the rivers to become freshwater reservoirs where Singapore needs fresh water. We connected the two reservoirs, added a lot of greenery. And as a result, we marry functional reasons with aesthetic design. And this is the type of environment you get with the Punggol River, and we have housing next to it with a lot of parks and linear parks. So these are the types of environments that we generate. And HDB flats can be very beautiful both internally and externally. And a lot of the young people actually do up their flats very nicely, as you can see here. It's very transit oriented because we want a car light town. So they're very well served by mass rapid transit or light rail. And we have a whole network of cycling and paths and park connectors for people to cycle and to walk as far as possible. We introduce a lot of greenery along biophilic principles using flora and fauna, water and soil to create outdoor comfort for people. So there's a lot of science behind the planting. Singapore is actually a garden city, but there's a lot of science behind the planting. And lately, we are emphasizing a lot on health and wellness, particularly after the pandemic. We built in facilities to encourage people to walk, to move, to run. The circuit that you see here on the right-hand side of the picture is actually not on the ground, it's actually on the roof. And we did the running circuit by joining up several blocks together. This is under construction. And in detailed design, we have to look at signages, colors, giving contrasting colors to grab bars in elderly homes, even as we have an aging population. So a lot of attention paid to design. But we do not just build and sell and go away. Because as I say, more than 80% live in public housing, we cannot afford them to deteriorate into slums. So we continuously upgrade, and we have many upgrading programs. We upgrade the entire town. We buy back some of the flats and upgrade. We have home improvement programs within the flat. We have neighborhood renewal programs in the surrounding neighborhoods. And we even revitalize our shops with many, many incentives and programs. I won't go into detail, but I think the key point here is you've got to do continuous rejuvenation of the town. We actually do a lot of research and design in the way we design and build our town. So even just in the last decade, we have looked at sustainable development. We are looking at, and we are already starting to put in a lot of smart technologies. We try to develop biophilic developments, and we are focusing on health and wellness. So the R&D is also applies to construction. Why? Because having to construct so many thousands of units of flats, we have to construct them productively with less manpower, with high quality, and as far as possible, reasonably cheaply. So we look at design. How do you use prefabrication? We look at advanced materials. We're starting to look at 3D printing, although I think it's some way off. We look at the logistics of construction using smart construction, and even post-construction using robotics for maintenance and using sensors for reliable services. So a lot of our development is constructed using prefabrication. We have moved from singular components to volumetric components. It's fast, it's high quality finish because we can control it at the factory. And we are starting to implement a lot of smart applications since 2014 to develop very livable, efficient, sustainable, and safe towns. So I'm just run through some of the smart applications we're using. For smart planning, what we do is we develop digital twins for all our towns to simulate different plans and designs. We test out on the digital twins, and we can model at a town level and at a precinct neighborhood level and at a building level. Actually, the whole of Singapore, there is already a digital twin. Why do we need to do this? Because what we do is we use a lot of computer simulations, for example, to simulate wind flows so that we have high quality air that comes through, the breezes that come through a very tropical climate for high quality air and natural ventilation. We try to reduce the use of air conditioning. We do noise modeling. Noise is one of the big challenges in high density cities. So when we do the noise modeling, we can adjust our designs to minimize noise from the traffic, for example. Solar irradiance studies, where are the heat spots? Those are places that we will do a lot of planting, and we know exactly where to put our solar panels for high efficiency. And of course, we put in a lot of sustainability initiatives. I won't go through this, but it's about renewable energy using solar, smart lighting to save energy, water efficient devices, pneumatic waste conveyance systems, and smart lighting, urban water harvesting. So many, many things that we do to reduce energy, to reduce the use of water, and to reduce carbon emissions as far as possible. In fact, HDB is the largest driver for solar PV systems in Singapore. And through the Solar Nova program, we aggregate demand even from other agencies, and we're able to bring down the price of solar and generate enough energy to power all the common areas using solar PV. And of course, once you have a lot of these utilities, you need to make sure they're reliable. We have 1.1 million flats with something like 25 to 26,000 lifts to maintain, for example. So we put in sensors in many of our amenities and facilities, whether it's solar, lifts, lighting, water pumps, irrigation, and we capture all the data and monitor it in the smart hub so that we can maintain them well. And if they have a fault, we can go and fix it. In fact, we are also collecting a lot of data and moving using AI and moving into predictive maintenance. Smart living really is about introducing smart applications into the home for day-to-day living. In Singapore, all households, including public housing, has broadband fiber and Wi-Fi is brought to the home. As a result, you can use a lot of smart applications. Telehealth was something that was very important during the pandemic. When a lot of people can't see the doctor, they actually did a lot of consultations, telehealth consultations. We have an aging population, so smart applications like elderly monitoring become quite important, and you can actually subscribe for some of these services. So if your parents have a certain pattern, one morning they're not moving, and there will be an alert sent to the caregiver or the children, and you can call home or get the neighbor to check on your parents. And of course, using utilities management so that you can reduce the consumption of water and energy. Smart communities is also about collecting data, having platforms that allows to, for example, enable simple booking of public amenities and public spaces. It can be used for participatory design and planning. We do a lot of public consultation and even develop gamification to nudge behavior like, could you please recycle your waste? So a smart community is about using a lot of these platforms, which are right now out there already. Let me just move on to the next slide. Yeah, smart transport. I think this is done everywhere, I'm sure, including LA. We collect a lot of data on transportation to manage traffic conditions. We're trying out autonomous vehicles. In Singapore, we practice congestion pricing since the 1970s. We're moving into a next generation congestion pricing architecture using satellite systems. And you have an onboard unit in your car. It can tell you the electronic road pricing charges in real time, and you get a lot of traffic alerts and conditions. So this is being implemented, I think, from this year onwards. And of course, smart parking. We can optimize the number of car parking lots because all you need to do is download this app and you can do parking, no gantries. It's very good for optimizing manpower and maintenance. And a lot of these smart applications are actually real. They have been implemented, and the first comprehensive smart precinct has just been completed in Singapore, in a public housing town. The last part I want to touch on really about uh, communities and fostering social resilience. Singapore is multiracial and multicultural. So integration of variety of races, religions, and culture is very important. The public housing town is designed such that we have a lot of shared spaces to encourage community interaction. And we mix flats and sizes. It doesn't mean all the rental flats are in one corner and the bigger flats are in another. We mix all the flats. And this is in the software policy, this is an interesting one. It can be quite controversial, but what we did is we have an ethnic integration policy. We make sure that every town has quotas whereby different ethnic groups will have a chance to live in the town. And it means that every town reflects the demographic mix nationally so that we do not have specific ethnic enclaves, because that can become very explosive. So this is an interesting issue that we could even discuss later if you have any questions. And the hardware, of course, is we do a lot of ground up grassroots. We get grassroots organizations and a lot of ground up activities to promote social interaction. So the way we design, we have many spaces for mass activities, for interstitial spaces for people to meet, and community living rooms where the community can get together to do activities together. And there are lots of activities on the ground, from building playgrounds, designing and building it themselves, engaging the community to plan the environment, the community themselves design and plan the environment. And to facilitate this ground up, we also put in facilitating measures like providing funding for neighbors who decide to put together a project. We train facilitators so that they can gather their neighbors and decide what they would like to do. And we give platforms whereby we throw out challenges, urban challenges that we want the community to try and solve together. So are they happy living in the towns? Well, we do surveys very regularly, and the latest survey was done at the end of 2018. The results were out last year. I think generally most people are quite satisfied with the living environment in the town. And we also look at the social aspects, whether people have a sense of belonging to the town, and it's in the high 90s. Is there trust and reciprocity? Has it increased? Are they proud to be in the community? I think the results are generally good. Participation is only about 50%. This is because everybody is very busy, and if for the young people, they are working. So I think as long as it's an increasing trend, people are participating, we're quite happy. So I want to conclude by saying that public housing in Singapore is not just about housing. It is about giving a good quality of living to enable us to have an equitable and stable society. It provides a social safety net for retirement adequacy. It strengthens social cohesion and the family, the sense of the family. It achieves sustainability and a quality environment. And what are the critical success factors? Well, I think that really it is about having very strong commitment from government to provide housing, and not just housing, but it focuses on home ownership. And then we have to figure out ways to finance, enable people to pay for their homes. And in our case, it's through the Central Provident Fund. And there must be continuous renewal and rejuvenation so that we don't have urban slums. And of course, the housing policies keep being adjusted. They're forward-looking and responsive as socio-economic changes occur and the demographics change as well. So with that, I'll just stop here and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cheong. And I think we have already a number of very good questions, but I do want to have our other panelists comment first. So let me turn it over to Vince Bertoni at this point. Vince, and again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure I'm not going, how long did you want me to go for, Richard?
About 10 minutes or so.
Okay, no problem. You need to give me a, time limit or else I'll just go into Michael's time. So,
Okay.
I thought that was, really interesting and fascinating in terms of how this would relate to some place like Los Angeles in terms of how we are working on that. Some of the things that really struck me about Singapore was, and hearing this, and I've not been there, so I'm hearing this, is just this idea of looking at life cycle needs in terms of that housing is not for just one particular part of your life, it's for all parts of your life. And that in sometimes in Los Angeles, I think we don't always remember that. We don't always remember that we need to, that we will have differing housing needs throughout the time, differing phases of our lives. And that here we need to see that that you can stay in the same community that you've been in throughout your life cycle, that throughout the different various stages of your life. And sometimes how your life will change can be expected, and sometimes it can be unexpected. So I really glommed onto, really was fascinated by this idea of that in the planning. Another thing that I think that really was interesting over this was just in general about, understanding there's various differences, right? In terms of in Singapore, it is very much government directed in terms of housing, and very much government overseeing the housing development. In Los Angeles and in California, the structure is very different, where we would have much more, we have a lighter touch, if you will, in terms on the production of housing, and we're more directing a capital market, looking at things such as, and you something that you mentioned in there, which I thought was really fascinating, was Dr. Cheong, was in one of your slides, I should have wrote it down, was this part about when you have the people have the flats, you allow them to rent out rooms, and it's a way that allows, if you will, wealth creation within the existing structure or context that you have there. So you're not only just looking at what are the different types of housing throughout the various stages of life, but also looking at, which we need to look at in Los Angeles a little bit, in terms of, we created a system which is very binary, which is either density in terms of apartments versus single family detached homes, and not a lot in between. And so thinking about all those different types of housing units that you looked at the life cycle, but also this idea of that kind of wealth creation when you rent out rooms. I think of, in California in particular, in Los Angeles, how we've looked at the production of what we call accessory dwelling units, which was enabled by the state of California, which has been sort of a wealth creation. And it started out very small, and now it's grown very much. So about we would have maybe before the state law changed and our local rules changed, we would have maybe 100 or so applications for these accessory dwelling units, which are basically, you can convert your garage into another unit, or you could put something in your backyard or add on to your house, your home. But we went, when the change of state law, to about 100 or so of these a year to over 5,000. So now they're about a quarter of our housing supply. So that idea of wealth creation within your homes is really kind of fascinating to me. I think this idea of obviously building their thinking about that connection with transit, and transit isn't just buses or subways or buses, but also bicycles and pedestrians, and that kind of range of what transit needs to be in terms of building through it. We have something called the transit-oriented communities incentives here, which we try to direct development near transit in terms of how you've really integrated that in to your design. And I think for the so that's something to me I think was really interesting. We have had, because we are much more of a we are not directing as in Singapore, but it's more of a if you will, like a shaping the market. We've come up with these incentives to really induce, or to really incentivize developers to build near our transit, which is both existing and in the future. So that could be subways and light rail, as well as high frequency bus service, and to try to really think about that. I was also looking at, I have a lot of notes, this idea of technology, and I was really interested in, this idea of modular and prefab. That's just something that's just becoming really something that could be really very much more common here. This idea, especially of modular housing, which can be prefab modular that can be used for multifamily, so that we could really look at. There's lots of advantages to that. There are some cost advantages, but there's definitely some environmental advantages in terms of you have much better control over where the unit is produced, and you have the disruption at the building site much less, because most of that you can kind of more separate where some of the impacts, that more negative impacts of the construction can be on there. And also, I was really kind of fascinated is for the people who are here in Los Angeles, maybe more of the planning nerds who love this wonkish stuff. I like the planning where you did some computer modeling of things such as wind and shade and things like that. And when LA, early on as its time as a city, we were first Tongva Tataviam people here for Native Americans, but when the first of the more European-based settlements came here, we were based upon there's the Spanish law of the Indies that looked at those things, that looked at winds and solar, and it was a whole prescription of how to plan a new town and how to site that, and when it to very much working with the natural environment, and I was really fascinated that you did a high-tech version of that in there. And also, this idea of that we're constantly rejuvenating the city, and this idea that the city's never done, right? And I think sometimes we think that the city is a place that's set in time, and maybe a particular time, and that it's not dynamic. And it is dynamic. Cities inherently are dynamic, and we have to be constantly thinking and rethinking them, and that we have to think as these cities that are so and these cities that are especially so diverse and so large and diverse, that we have to think of these large and diverse places as really as evolving over time, and being able to evolve with the changing needs of the city and the people who are living there, who are working there, who are coming there, who might be immigrating there, as well as the people who are already there. And this idea of the city as a dynamic place, and as a place that is not set in time. And I also was just really, taken by that issue of, the obvious one, which is where there is not, where you've really kind of thought about that connection to, and I'm maybe going a little bit back to this issue of the environment, that kind of really connection that with density, which you have density, and comes this obligation to really think about the public outdoor spaces near there. So when people are living in dense places, that you can really provide that access, which is something which is kind of not as common in a place like Los Angeles. So we think so much of our recreation and private and spaces have been very private because we were fairly low rise for a long time. But this idea of evolving both into a high rise city that has a well developed and attainable, if you will, very reachable open space and recreation space. So very much enjoyed that, and I'll just end it there just because I want to make sure I hit my 10-minute mark. I'll hand it back to.
That was exactly 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
I do a lot of public meetings. I'm
so eager to ask you both questions now, but I'm going to now turn it over to Mike Manville and let him do that. So Michael, what are your takeaways from the last 45 minutes or so?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot, and I'm sure I won't fit them adequately into 5 minutes. So let me just hit a couple things. I mean, I think the first is that it's a fascinating juxtaposition of these two places. And I have also, like Vince, I've never been to Singapore. I would love to go, but so I'm speaking just based on the presentation, which was tremendous. I think, in watching it, I had two thoughts. One is that there are a lot of things Singapore does that seem to work very well that Los Angeles probably just couldn't do, right? That one of the advantages Singapore has is that it is a city, but also a sovereign, right? And so it's able to, as the central national government, do a lot of redistributive policies that a local government like Los Angeles would have a hard time doing, financing housing and then letting that financing come back in a buyback program that can then be kicked over to, that's something that a local government in the United States, the nature of our federalist system, makes very difficult. It seems like a great policy, right? But it's just, something that a city in the United States would have a hard time doing. But the other thing Singapore seems to do very well, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little about the homeownership model, because I think that seems to work very well, but I don't think that's essential, right? And I think in many ways in the United States, we've kind of overemphasized homeownership. But I think Singapore is a lesson in that, like, all different models of tenure work well if housing is abundant, right? It just seems that Singapore produces a lot of housing. And that's just something that LA could do and doesn't. And LA could not, right? I think Vince is absolutely correct. LA is not going to become a builder the way the government of Singapore is. But LA also doesn't have to become a builder because there's just lots of people who are dying to build in Los Angeles. And so the very heavy hand that Los Angeles exercises is to stop people from building, right? I mean, it's not accurate to say that LA doesn't have a heavy hand. I mean, because it has an incredibly heavy hand, which is an absolute hammer to enforce the status quo and basically to enforce the privilege of the lucky and the affluent. And if we could just sort of now it's very hard, obviously, for political reasons, to remove that emergency brake that's on our housing supply. But I think one thing we can take away from Singapore is just that if you do let more housing come online, you can get a lot of good outcomes. And this is, the obligatory things need to be said, which is that it's not everything. Supply alone doesn't solve the problem. Singapore is a great example of how we need other policies to think about, people in different stages of their life and in people in different socioeconomic strata. But for me, the seeming ease with which large amounts of housing can be brought online seems to be the single largest difference between sort of the affordability you've demonstrated in Singapore and the struggles we have here. And I won't go on longer than that. I know I only have 5 minutes. I do think that there's other things to be said about Singapore's, very progressive transportation policies, which I think, are enabled in many ways by that density, right? That it's very hard to have people buy into cycling and in walking and congestion pricing and so forth if you don't have them already living in a built environment where that's feasible, right? And I think one of the struggles we're having in Los Angeles is that we are staying so spread out in many ways, so that when you say to people, well, we're going to have trains, we're going to have a bus only lane, it's hard for them to log that as realistic. And so there is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. But yeah, I'll stop there. I'm really eager to hear what the Q&A folks say. I thank you both for that presentation, and thank you, Director Bertoni, for your thoughts.
Mike, thanks so much for that. Let me just follow up a little bit. I just want to ask one question of my own, and then I'm going to turn it over to this set of audience questions. But one of the things I wonder about in Singapore, and I actually have been there 5 or 6 years, and frankly, the first time I went, I wasn't expecting to like it very much, and I've come to really admire it very much over time as I've got to know it better and better. I still don't like the weather that much, but that's something that a whole lot can't be done about that. It is a very, very hot city. But every time I come back, I admire it more and more because of what Dr. Cheong was saying. This is not puffery, her description of what they've done. It is real. It is really quite extraordinary. But what I wonder is whether people get to choose where they live. Now, I want to make a contrast a little clear. We in LA like to think that one of the great things about LA, one of the great things about any American city, is people can choose to live wherever they wish. That's not actually true. I mean, my example of that is I'm married to a physician. We are, by any standards, very well off people, and there are places in Los Angeles we can't afford to live. So there really are, I mean, we're very, very fortunate in that overwhelmingly we can choose to live where we want in LA, but even we can't afford to live wherever. And I don't mean the size of the house. I mean, there are neighborhoods in LA. Manhattan Beach, I can't afford to live there, for example. Malibu, well, I could have a teeny tiny little house, but I would not want that. So for many people in LA, they really don't have a lot of choice in where they can live. It really is circumscribed, but by price. And in Singapore, it must be the case that because the vast majority of housing is subsidized, that there has to be an allocation mechanism other than price that determines where people live. So how does that work, Dr. Cheong? How is it determined where people get to live?
Yeah, okay. Of course, there are so many different towns. And what we do is we try to have a number of units for sale across different zones and different regions, because people live and work, they work at different places, so or their families are in different regions, so they want to live there. So we try to have a good spread across the entire island every time we launch a sale, and people can choose to buy wherever they want. So there is a choice. So in fact, we provide the choice. We make sure there's a choice so that people can have those choices. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
You don't run into the situation where you have units, and I'm just going to make this up. This is not a reflection of any real thing, but let's say you have East choices and West choices.
Oh, yes.
You don't find that some people, that way more people want to live in West than they want to live in.
Agreed. So it is demand and supply, and obviously the better locations nearer the city, they cost more. And a lot of people may actually want to live there. And what we have is a balloting system. So we go by ballot. So if you choose to go to a town where lots of people want to live there, then your chance of getting a unit is not as good as one that is probably less popular, but a little further away. But Singapore is very small. You can get anywhere within half an hour to 45 minutes. So even if you are saying I'm further away, you're really talking about 45 minutes away, or, it's not like hours away. So, but of course, people will always have their preferences. They like to live in certain great locations with good views or amenities. That's why we try to provide amenities for every town, so that we try to level off the playing field as much as possible. But there will always be people who want the popular estates, and it is allocated by ballot.
So a question from Sheldon Laser, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing people's names, but, and this is for Koon Hean, what in general is the structure of getting units built and maintained? Is there one or more government entities which oversee the program? Does the private sector in any way participate in these programs?
Absolutely. Now, there are so many types of programs that we have tried out, but essentially the government does more or less the planning together with many, many agencies. In fact, the building of a new town or a town is very complex. You have to bring in all the other agencies, the guys who build the roads, the utilities, the sewers, the parks that are built. So the Housing and Development Board actually acts as the master planner, and we work with many agencies, right? But in the construction, so we do the planning. We hire a private sector consultants. We do some of the design ourselves, but the majority, we tap on the private sector to do the design. So the consultants actually are from the private sector. And when we build, they are all tendered and they are built by the private construction sector. So essentially the government more or less sets policies, is the master planner and developer, all right? And it sets policies mainly on subsidies, for example, and access, eligibility conditions. But the whole building is all really done by the private sector. Now, we've actually attempted to get private developers to build for us before. We have actually tried some schemes like that. But we found that actually the quality is not so good. It's quite ironic, you know. Actually, the private developer would try to cut corners to get the maximum profits. So there's a limit to which you can control the quality. Whereas when we build it ourselves, we found that the quality is actually a lot better. We can control it better because of the scale that we have. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, but when it comes to the construction per se, that's the private sector, correct?
Private sector, it's all private sector contractors.
And so I'm a little curious, how did you get, so one of the issues we faced in the US is we've been trying to think about doing these sort of prefab techniques you're talking about.
Yes.
And have implemented so successfully is getting it to scale. And
Yeah.
there's a very well-known company, Catella, that's gotten into, that basically just went bankrupt within the last month or so, that was trying to do this. So how did you successfully get these production techniques to work at scale?
Well, firstly, the HDB builds at scale. So for a lot of the prefab companies, they need to be assured of a certain pipeline of projects in order to be viable. And because we have scale, they are more viable because they can invest in the manufacturing facility. But the HDB itself, we do a lot of research into the design quality, even the detailing. So we have teams of engineers and architects that actually develop a lot of these details together with the industry, and we disseminate them very freely to the industry and let people use these details in their manufacture. So in a way, we're also leading the industry and teaching them how to do some of these things. And because we provide scale, it makes it viable for them. Now, the Building Construction Authority is an agency we work closely with, and they also try to incentivize people moving to more of these prefabricated construction because it is just more efficient, uses less energy, uses less foreign manpower, and it's efficient. And if you have scale, it's actually very cost effective, and the quality is a lot better. You can control the quality because it's factory produced. So it's a whole ecosystem that you have to develop in order to scale.
So roughly speaking, what does it cost to build a, let's say, 100 square meter flat in Singapore? Just the just the construction cost.
Okay, it's hard because the prices fluctuate. I would say it's maybe 1,200, 1,300. But you cannot just look at the construction cost because okay, this is the part I didn't quite explain because it would have taken a lot of time. Actually, when we sell a flat, it doesn't matter what is the construction cost. We price flats based on affordability. You know, I was explaining about the Central Provident Fund, and we make sure we study the demographics and the income levels of people, and we're able to pack our housing units to cater to different percentile of income. So what the government does is we absorb the fluctuations in the construction industry. So for example, during COVID, the construction cost is extremely high, but we do not increase the price of the flat because we look at income levels and based on affordability to guide the sale price. So it's actually delinked.
Okay,
But
but
of
of
course,
course, the size of the subsidy then depends on construction costs, right? So from a
exactly, it
budget
does.
standpoint, it matters to the
Yes,
government.
it does. It does. So we have to try to build efficiently, as efficient as we can.
Yeah. So I think so if, I mean, and I understand it fluctuates, but 1,200 a square meter would be like about $110 a square foot. That's very inexpensive.
Yeah, but that's just construction costs. You see, there's also land costs and all the
Right.
other things.
No, understood. No, I was just getting into building, and that is quite extraordinary. There's a question from Pritio Widiarta, and again, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, and I think this is for, I would like everyone on the panel to answer this, and I think maybe Vince and Mike first, but they're right. Appreciate that in Singapore, the government plays a big role in designing the city and people's lives. And I think implicit in that, Americans wouldn't accept that level of control. They just won't. But what do the experts here think about how to achieve similar results through private efforts where government has a smaller role? What is the minimum involvement of government necessary to ensure people's interests are represented? So I would love it if Vince or Mike or both of you would take on that question with your thoughts.
Go for it, Mike. I'll go after you.
Fair enough. I mean, it's a great question, and I think the poser of the question is correct in the sense that it'll be a ways, right, before a typical American city goes all in with public housing, right? We have a very different experience with public housing here, and in some ways that experience is misrepresented unfairly, but it doesn't have a lot of political traction. But to the crux of the question, I think, I hinted at it a bit in my earlier comments, which is to say that it's underappreciated to some extent, the extent to which our governments in the US are just in the way of some of these outcomes, right? So that we could accomplish a lot by simply stepping back. And I think that is also something that people have a hard time with, right? So on the one hand, we don't want the government to step in and say, here's what we're going to do. But on the other hand, we are very accustomed in the US in the planning system to see our government as a guarantor of the current status, right? I mean, this is, one of the underlying principles of American zoning is that it offers some stability, it offers some certainty, and that is a valid role of zoning. But because we have fallen into maybe a place on the pendulum where we value that stability a bit too much, we don't have what Vince referred to in his comments about this, an openness to the fact that one way or the other, the city will change, right? Even if it doesn't physically change, it's going to change demographically as it gets much more expensive. And so I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, but I think that, were we to accept that a very affirmative government is probably a little bit elusive in the United States, then what we can work on is an appeal to our government sort of stopping doing some of the things that obstruct these outcomes, whether that's, an abundance of R1 zoning, whether that's an insistence on everything we build has to have a bunch of parking, whether it's an insistence on very wide streets where the prevailing speed, that's the speed limit. All these things sort of add up. What the commonality in them is that from the perspective of the individual property owner, they all seem perhaps rational. They add up to a city that a lot of us don't like very much.
Thanks, Michael. I'd just add to that in terms of, we're talking about very different systems, right? One where it's very directly related, where the government, and I think Michael said very well, it's everything, it's city and state and federal and everything in one, which we don't necessarily have here, and therefore can direct some things very, very specifically. And we in the United States have developed a very different system, which we basically said, we're going to allow the private sector to occur and we're going to regulate it in a manner. And it's that tension of how we regulate it is vastly important. And I think what's happened is is that it's just settled into a status quo, which hasn't been perhaps as responsive as it has needed to have been. To acknowledge an evolving city, we have to be constantly changing. The city itself is not going to be able to respond in a setting like Los Angeles without changing its regulation in a thoughtful way that's responding to what its needs are and what needs to happen. And I think we have to be able to take risks, which government isn't always very good at. I always think about where we are in this. We are in a crisis of housing. We're a crisis of housing of all types, including affordable types, and a crisis of people who are unhoused. And I always think about, as a planning director over my career, the one quote that always goes through my mind, which I don't know if it's a correct quote or not, was from Einstein saying, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I'm constantly going through that in my mind, is that if we want housing to be more affordable, what are we going to do differently? Understanding we're not the ones with the money building it. So we have to react to the market. And so how do we do that in a thoughtful way? And I think that in that question, I think about that in some ways, we just haven't been as nuanced enough in terms of our planning and really thinking through land economics as much and understanding that relationship. It's almost like, just like in Singapore, you may do the economic analysis to understand what it's going to cost you to build. We need to be doing some of that economic analysis to understand what are regulations and how they need to be modified to produce the result that we're looking for. We also have to be willing to take risks and understand that answers may come from places we didn't think they would come from. I will tell you, I don't know anyone who thought that transit-oriented communities incentives or TOC incentives would amount to much when it was in Measure JJJ. And these are coming from any area of the spectrum. Some of my friends who are pro-housing just said at the time, okay, let's just see, and we didn't, quite frankly, at our end, we didn't understand the power of that. There was some economic analysis that was done to it, not as detailed as before, as much, but it's this idea that now it's producing about 40 to 50% of our housing coming in. So in my mind, and accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are around a quarter to a fifth of our housing units coming in per year, and then transit-oriented communities is about 40%, let's say, in any given year. And I don't know that anybody put much stock in them. Those were unusual things to do, and I think that we need to be looking to get out of where we need to be from a housing crisis. We need to be looking at everything in the city of LA. We need to be looking at all of our communities. We have to be looking at all different housing types. And that's what the takeaway I can come from, from Singapore, is how you looked at things so comprehensively in your housing types and how you really thought through the needs of varying different people in your society, and that you are consciously trying to house them. And I think we need to take that same approach, although our tools will be very different than that. But that needs to be our approach, and understanding that this city is not set, and we can't be happy with just doing what we've always done in the past.
Richard, can I just add a quick comment to maybe add to the context of the discussion, because it seems to, some of the comments seem to suggest that there may be regulations or zoning rules, that is preventing more housing from being built. Now, beyond the housing that's built by the Public Housing Authority, the Housing Development Board, we actually, this is in my other role when I used to plan Singapore, actually it's a very comprehensive collective exercise whereby we project very long term into the future, very comprehensively, all the development needs. And this covers housing and, of course, commercial needs, social needs, recreation needs. And we already know, because there was a question somewhere to ask, how do you know where to put housing land? Now, there's an umbrella plan that covers the whole of the city-state, where we know exactly where is the housing land to be built by both the HDB and the private sector, not just the Housing Development Board. Because what the government does is they have a land sales program, and the private developer is the one who will build the remaining types of housing, which is more like in your case, you see. So I think the zoning takes into consideration projected housing needs. So that's the first question. Do you know how much housing you need? And have you zoned enough land to actually have that housing provided, be it by the private sector or the government. And then even so in the private sector, then what incentives and what regulations can you put in to have that housing provided by the private sector? Because in most parts of the world, that's what happens. You know, you tell them you have to provide 20% of your housing, we'll give you planning approval. And then there is a certain incentive, right? You could even put the incentives in the grant of the planning approval in order for him to supply you with that 20 or 30% affordable housing. So I think it's about thinking of very clever ways. But firstly, you do need to know you have enough land zone to enable people to build housing, and you have to do your projections based on the demographic and the income levels of the people living in the city. So that part I didn't mention. I thought I'll just set the context for the public housing.
So, Mike, maybe I missed reading your body language, but do you want to comment on that?
Oh, no. I was just sort of nodding along.
Yeah, I mean, there is a well-known UCLA planning dissertation by Greg Morrow that has the history of zoning in Los Angeles. And in 1960, it was zoned to hold 10 million people. And now it's zoned to hold 4.3 million people, although that doesn't include ADUs. So if you added ADUs, I don't know, to be fair, what it is now. And LA has 4 million people. So basically, and that was not through planning that these zoning changes happened. It was through referenda. It was political activists put on the ballot down zoning that reduced our zoning capacity, which I think probably is one of our greatest impediments to providing enough. No, I shouldn't say probably, it is the greatest impediment to us being able to provide the housing that we need in the city. We're over our time a little bit, but if you'll be patient with me, I would like to ask Dr. Cheong one more question. It's coming from the audience, and it came via Facebook. It's one of the big issues we're facing in Los Angeles. We're unfortunately world famous for our unsheltered homelessness problem. We have about 60,000 homeless in Los Angeles County, of whom somewhere in the order of 3/4 are unsheltered. How does Singapore deal with this issue? And has it dealt with it successfully?
Yeah, well, I think a homeless problem exists in every city, but when you come to Singapore, you hardly see them, mainly because beyond public housing, we also have transition shelters, and we call them rough sleepers. But there are not so many of them. I think there are probably 1,000 or less, And if you talk to them, actually a lot of them have homes, They sometimes don't go home because they have a family dispute or something, So we do have places that they can go to, but it's only a handful. So it's really quite manageable. So I think that's the issue of.
And do you think the reason it's manageable is just because there's enough housing in Singapore to begin with, or is it because social services are good, or what is it that keeps that number low?
It's both. It's both. We have enough housing, and for these people who cannot afford, and for some reason they just want to be rough sleepers, there's always a reason, right? It could be mental, it could be a family issue, And so what the social services do assist them, and there is transition shelter. But it's not just putting them in the shelter. We have to understand, why are they rough sleeping, Is it a family issue? Is it really because they can't afford to have a home? Or is it, and if they're really without a job, then you have to help in the other aspects. Can we find them a job? Can we help them? So it's not just the housing. The housing is really the symptom, right? You got to get to the basic problem. Is it because they don't have a job, or do they have a mental illness, or I think every city will have some of these. But if you do come to Singapore, you will not see anybody sleeping on the street, mainly because almost everybody have a place to go to, you see.
Okay, well, Dr. Cheong, Koon, Hean, Vince Bertoni, Michael Manville, thank you very much for joining this Asian Society of Southern California event tonight. I think it was enlightening, at least it was for me. I hope our audience found it enlightening as well. Charlie, do you want to wrap us up?
Thanks so much, Richard. Deepest gratitude to Dr. Cheong and Professor Manville and Director Bertoni, as well as you, for an amazing discussion about a truly vital and critical issue for us in Los Angeles. And it was really enlightening for me also to see, what Singapore has done over the last several years. And personally, having been to Singapore many times, it was really interesting to me to know about that. Singapore really started in a very difficult place and managed through a very steady and very diligent way, managed to get to where they are, which is really probably the greatest standard for affordable housing in the world today. So thank you all for an incredible discussion. We also like to thank our promotional partners for this evening, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, the Asian Business League of Southern California, Abundant Housing LA, Global San Francisco, the Korean Realty Association of Southern California, the Singapore University of Technology and Design, at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing, and the Singapore Institute of Planners. And a special thanks to the Luskin School and the Ziman Center and the UCLA Lusk Center for Real Estate for
Excuse me, Charlie, you said UCLA Lusk Center.
I'm sorry, the Luskin Center, the Ziman Center, and the USC Lusk Center for real estate housing, as well as the USC Marshall School of Business IBER program, as well as the Department of Real Estate at the National University of Singapore and the Urban Land Institute Singapore. We thank everybody for their their help in making this program possible. We also like to thank our founding sponsor, OUE, for making the US Asia Real Estate Initiative and this program possible. We hope that you will consider becoming a member of Asia Society or donating to Asia Society. We make these programs for free, and we hope you'll join us and support our programming. Also, our next programming will be Asia Society at the Movies, which is an international undertaking for Asia Society, and we'll be doing a retrospective of the well-renowned Chinese director Ning Hao and his films during this month and next month, including a conversation with the director Ning Hao and his producing partner Ellen Eliasov. So we hope you'll join us, and thank you again for an incredible conversation. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Ken.